All right, I want to welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. We're going to get started now. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy there. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. Ed, you're sitting up here for this timely conversation. We did this is an annual event. Sort of look into what's happening in energy and economy and geopolitics in the Gulf Arab countries and the GCC region. We did this event last year with some, not all of the participants here, a little bit of a different mix, to talk about how the GCC countries were responding to what at the time was a new oil world, one of the steepest oil price collapses in history, having very significant geopolitical and economic effects throughout the region, and wanted to explore what those implications would be. And since then, had a lot of change, both in the region and also in the United States, that makes this an especially timely conversation. In oil markets, continued low prices with some recovery, now a new, seemingly renewed effort, we'll talk about it, by OPEC to try to regain control of oil markets. Now questions about how quickly shale will respond and what that means for prices. Questions about oil demand in the medium and longer term. And all of that placing significant fiscal pressures on countries in the GCC region. And then continued very ambitious economic reform agenda, spurred in part by these fiscal pressures, most perhaps notably with Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, but in other countries throughout the GCC as well. And at the same time, a new administration coming into the United States that raises many questions and uncertainties about what U.S. policy will be toward the Middle East, the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia that has become, and some might say, a bit more strained. We'll talk about that. U.S. policy and posture toward Iran and the Iran deal and the negotiations over sanctions regarding the nuclear program there. And obviously, most recently, we actually have a different mix of panelists than we were supposed to have because of the inability of some people from the region to come because of the restrictions that were put in place over the last few days from the new administration. And then just today, I saw the National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, putting Iran on notice after its ballistic missile test. And so we'll talk about what that means. So there's a lot to talk about today. I want to welcome everyone. All of this, by the way, I should note on the way out, relates to what the outlook for the oil market is. And one question about that is oil market volatility. And we last week released a new book from the Center on Global Energy Policy, Crude Volatility, which is available for purchase outside if anyone wants one. This event, like all center events, is being webcast live. The full video will be online. The audio will be on our podcast channel on iTunes in the next couple of days. And we'll have a conversation up here, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Those of you watching online, as always, can ask questions as well through Twitter using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. So with that, let me tell you who's here today, and it really is an all-star cast of experts on the GCC region. Starting from, I guess, the far left, Ed Morse, who's Managing Director and Global Head of Commodities at Citi Research.
Your far left.
Yes, far left, exactly.
Never mind.
One of the, someone well known to all of you who follow global oil markets, a very good friend of the Energy Center, including a member of our advisory board and one of the sort of go-to experts and top thinkers in the world on understanding all matters related to global energy markets. Next is Ambassador Joe Westphal, who served as the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia for about the last 3 years, I think, maybe a little bit less, until just about a week ago. And it's a pleasure to have you join us in New York today. I know you're undergoing a lot of transition, relocating from your post in Riyadh. Ambassador Westphal previously served as acting Secretary of the Army, Undersecretary of the Army under President Obama, and was the Chancellor of the University of Maine system before going back into government in the Obama administration. And then Bernie Haykel. Dr. Bernie Haykel is a professor of Near Eastern Studies and director of the Trans-Regional Institute for the Study of the Middle East and North Africa at Princeton University, one of the go-to academic experts on all things related to the Middle East, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and other GCC countries, and has written many books, I won't list them all, related to these topics. Dr. Adnan Shihab-Eldin, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to Columbia. You joined us here last year as well. The former acting Secretary General and Director of Research at OPEC, and now currently the Director General of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science. And then finally, Dr. Stffen Hertog from the London School of Economics, previously the Kuwait professor at Sciences Po, and his research interests cover, again, all things related to Gulf politics, Middle East political economy. His book about Saudi state building, princes, brokers, and bureaucrats, oil and the state in Saudi Arabia, is on my desk and is an excellent primer on understanding the role of oil in the Saudi economy. So I'm going to take a seat now, and we're going to have a conversation for a bit, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. Please join me in welcoming our guests to Columbia. Okay, so it's a little hard to know where to start, but maybe I'll start, Ambassador Westphal, with you, and I'm going to ask a kind of one or two open-ended questions first, let you take them in the direction you want. But you've just come back from a posting to Riyadh. Thank you for your service to the country as our representing the United States in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I said in my opening remarks there is perhaps a perception that that the United States and the Obama administration raised some concerns in the kingdom. People were not always thrilled with U.S. policy toward the region, with the rapprochement toward Iran, and that there were more strain in the U.S.-Saudi relationship in recent years. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your perception on the current status of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, to the extent there has been some tension. What you think the path forward is. You were there when President Obama visited. If you could talk a little bit about how that went, and then look forward and what you know or anticipate or might guess would be the posture of this incoming administration toward Saudi Arabia, and what that means for the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi, and why you think what's at stake in that relationship.
Okay, thank you. Delighted to be here, and I was there for 3 visits by President Obama. The first one, I went with him. I had just been confirmed by the Senate 3 years ago. And then 2 subsequent visits, although he paid a visit before I arrived. So President Obama made 4 visits to Saudi Arabia during his presidency, more so than any other president. George Bush, I believe, had 2, and that was more than anybody else. So I think when you look at the U.S.-Saudi relationship, the tendency is to look at it from the standpoint of these hot-button issues: Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Iran. However, I think you also need to look at the relationship in terms of the sort of long-standing commercial, business, education, the comprehensive nature of the relationship that we have with countries around the world, and we have in particular with Saudi Arabia. There were tensions on these issues, for example, Yemen, particularly in the last year and a half, mostly emanating from the White House, mostly pushed by different sectors within American society and Europe. But in general, the broader set of relationships that we have established with Saudi Arabia on education, on healthcare, on commercial and trade relations, on energy, and a number of other sectors remain very, very strong. And it was only because of the Saudis' desire to reduce some spending as a function of the transformation plan and seek more foreign investment from us that the robust nature of that commercial relationship had a little bit of a slide as we both countries adjusted to this new vision and this transformation plan. So I would say that, on one hand, the president and the administration generally supported very strongly the transformation plan and the vision. In fact, we did a very lengthy and detailed interagency assessment of it with very key, very detailed points about whether the United States, both as a government and as a society, could participate in support of this transformation. And it was very late in the process. It was really just this year and before the end of the administration. So it was not going to have the opportunity to get implemented, certainly by the administration, President Obama's administration. But at least there was an effort to say, we think this is a good strategy and a good plan. It's a challenge. It's a huge challenge, but we're committed to helping make that happen. I'll end with your point about this administration. I think the Saudis will, as they always do, they are extremely, how do I say this? They're extremely generous and supportive, and very gracious in their relationship. When I left the country, I had a sort of a farewell with King Salman, which is sort of unprecedented for an ambassador to do that. We spent about an hour. We did talk about issues. We talked about Middle East peace for quite a while. We talked about a number of other things. And then he made it very clear that he wanted to send two messages with me back to Washington. One to President Obama, thanking him for the broad relationship that we have had throughout his administration. I thought that was very, very gracious. And then asked me to send a message to the Trump administration to say that they want to continue along that path. They look to a stronger, more vigorous relationship as time unfolds with both the transformation plan and the challenges in the region. And so I think, as you can see from the week and a half of this, whatever it is, a week and a half or 2 weeks now of an administration, we've seen reaching out to Saudi Arabia and an effort at least to start coalescing around certain key issues.
So I just want to follow up. I mean, to be more pointed about some of the things that raised those questions, I think, the widely noted and publicized article in The Atlantic that people saw with President Obama maybe almost going out of his way to raise questions about the historic U.S.-Saudi relationship, the JASTA bill, the 9/11 bill that raised a lot of concern in the kingdom, and just generally the perception that many in the region saw with how the U.S. handled the Arab Spring, Mubarak, the Syria situation. Give us your perception about how what the reality there was and how that is perceived in the kingdom.
Well, there's no question that there were huge setbacks to the relationship as a result of all of those different episodes you mentioned. But that was mostly on the political side. Yet, despite strong disagreements, in every meeting that the president had, every meeting that the Secretary of State had, and he had, I don't remember how many meetings Kerry had, but during my watch, I think we had over 30 visits from him. And in every single one of those meetings, there was a real effort made to try to find some common ground, although it was very difficult in some areas because, well, the Secretary of State sometimes was frustrated by the White House on their positions on certain key issues. And the president himself was very honest and very clear with the king and the Crown Prince, the Deputy Crown Prince, where he stood. So there was a pragmatic aspect to the relationship, very, very clear from the part of the president, but the disagreements were there nevertheless. However, that doesn't define, that's what I'm trying to say, is it doesn't define the extent of the complete aspects of the relationship. Their biggest issue today, the biggest issue today, in my view, is they have to find a way out of this dilemma that they have. Oil prices, even if they go up, are not going to solve the issue. I can give you lots of statistics of what I'm talking about, but they've got to find a way out. And they see the United States, whether with President Obama, President Trump, or any other president, they see the United States as a key ally and partner in getting through this effort. And so they look for the best, and they look for that relationship.
And if the U.S. were to seek rapprochement with Iran, easing of sanctions, opening Iran up to the global economy, it's maybe less clear if that's where this administration will be, but if that were the position of the U.S., is that necessarily a zero-sum in terms of this relationship the U.S. has with Saudi, that inevitably if you become warmer with Iran, that's going to damage the Saudi relationship, or can you do both?
Well, I don't see this administration getting any warmer with Iran, so I don't think that that's a, I'm not going to fall for that trap, Jason. For quite a while I was there, Iran was to be blamed for everything bad that happened in the region. They were the nemesis. I think that attitude has declined a little bit and become more realistic about all of the forces that affect change in the region, of which the United States is a part, but so is Europe, so is Russia now with its engagement and involvement. So I think I don't think they see rapprochement with Iran. I don't think that they would require this administration or want this administration to pull back completely on the agreement with Iran. They may want some stronger stipulations about Iran's behavior in the region and more vigorous assessment of Iran's nuclear development in whatever direction it's going.
Adnan, I want to ask you about sort of the economic condition in the region, how people in Kuwait and neighboring countries have responded to the oil price drop. But first, maybe if you could respond to what you just heard and your perception of U.S. policy toward the region over the last couple of years, and how your reaction, and maybe if you could speak more broadly about how you think the reactions people have had to what they've seen over the last 2 weeks with a new incoming administration, to the extent that that's given them things that they may be optimistic about, or things that they're deeply concerned about, and what those are.
Well, things have been happening very rapidly over the last 10 days, so it's very difficult to give an answer to the last part of your question. But let me just start by saying I concur with the views that were presented by Ambassador. I think he's right that in the region, in the Gulf region, the issue of Iran has been very high on the mind of both the people, but more importantly, on the decision makers and policy makers. And that, to a large extent, governed how they reacted or interacted with the Obama administration, especially over the last few years. There has been extreme disappointment at the public level and at the government level with a number of key decisions that have been taken by the Obama administration, in particular vis-a-vis Syria and to some extent Yemen, although I think in the case of Yemen it's the administration, Obama administration, has been really supportive, although there have been logistic support and so on. But there has been significant disappointment with the previous administration, U.S. administration. And that explains why, at least at the government level, if you speak to very high officials, ministers, undersecretaries, prior to, even during the campaign, when President Trump at that time was carrying out his campaign with the rhetorics, and which was not well received by the media here and by a good part of the public in the United States, and by the public in the Middle East and in the Gulf. It was not well received. But at the level of the government, a lot of people were saying is that forget about the rhetorics. What matters is what is going to happen. And they basically were of the view that a change may offer something better than what is currently happening. Although they don't have a reason to believe that a change necessarily, or they don't have an evidence that the change will bring necessarily something positive. But the view at the higher level was a change probably is better than the status quo or the evidence we have had with the Obama administration on several fronts, in particular the political ones. And so that's more or less how I see it. And I've been speaking to a number of ministers, and I was sometimes amazed to give the Trump administration, before it took office and after it took office over the last week, is that don't worry about the rhetorics. Let's see what happens in reality. And for example, today, the announcement today by Flynn, General Flynn, I think it's music to the ears of many of those officials that I have spoken to over the past months or weeks, that's what they are looking for. An example, that's on the political side, on the military side, but they're looking for something like that in every aspect that will contrast some of their disappointments, strong disappointments with the Obama administration. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that I share that view as an analyst or as an observer. I really don't know what's going to happen. When I read the rhetorics, I'm concerned. And I was just walking in, I was one of my colleagues here on the panel, we were saying is that it seems like every promise that President Trump said on the campaign trail is being implemented within 2 weeks. So almost, you don't have to wait for 100 days. I think he will exhaust the list within the next few weeks. In fact, last night, I was telling myself, what would he invent after a few weeks? Because almost everything would be checked. Yes, 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 yes. The problem is that what is the result? I don't know what the consequences. In the case of Mexico, I was talking to Adrian earlier, is that it seems like the officials in Mexico were of the same views of the Gulf. However, the first action that affected Mexico probably turned the Mexican officials around. And I'm not so sure what will turn around the officials in the Gulf against the Trump administration, or whether they will continue to expect positive things to come out of it. So that's on the political side. Mm-hmm. I don't know what was the second part. I forgot.
Well, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the economic situation in the Gulf region in response to the low oil price, the reforms that Kuwait and neighboring countries have undertaken, and the current status of those. And then closer to the microphone. Closer to the microphone? Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fair to say that the low oil price phase that we have seen over the past 2 years has been a very strong wake-up call to the Gulf countries, which is long overdue, and it's basically compelled the governments to accelerate actions that should have been enacted long time before. And those actions have been talked about for many decades, but really never really materialized. But I think this time it became very serious, because what I saw in the low oil price environment that started in 2014, and we are still in it, it's a structural change, it's a phase change, and therefore this low price environment is going to continue for a while. And I think the people got it in the government, and therefore they had to react. And they have started all of these economic reforms at various levels, whether it is in terms of removing subsidies, balancing the budget, increasing revenues, more fundamentally diversification of the economy, which has been talked about since the 60s and 70s, but never really materialized. We continue in the Gulf to be basically dependent dominantly on oil revenues to drive government revenues and to drive economic activities in terms. Now, those reforms vary from one country to another. And I think if I take my country, Kuwait, I could talk a little bit about Kuwait, but I don't think Kuwait really is that important in the Gulf countries context for a variety of reasons. One of them, it's a small size. And second, it's got a special conditions because it's small size, because it has accumulated enough wealth, investments. It cushions its challenges for decades. While in the case of Saudi Arabia, because of the population, because of the internal situation, I think Saudi Arabia cannot afford to wait decades before it sees the results of the economic reforms. And therefore, I think it was almost inevitable that you saw the vision that was announced, 2035, and the plans and all of the steps that have been taking place. What is happening? Is it really on the right track or not? I think it's too early to tell, but I am of the view that it has a good chance of success for a variety of reasons, but first and foremost is that you have young leadership right now in control. And number two, the young leadership is surrounded by Saudi Arabian technocrats who have been well trained. I mean, I'll just give you an example. One example that comes to my mind is the Minister of the expanded portfolio of energy and industry, who used to be the CEO of Aramco, Khalid Al-Faleh. I mean, he's a technocrat, very smart technocrat, has been groomed for decades, and now he's in decision making. And he is surrounded by people like him who came from Aramco, and you could sort of take it one ministry at a time, and you see a lot of people like that, educated in the United States, trained in the United States, have been exposed to a lot of the modern techniques of management and administration. So I believe this could really help it to work. I'm not so sure it's going to work, but I think this is a good ingredient. And there is another factor, is that the Saudis' leadership, they recognize that they have a big problem on their hand of the youth. The majority, I mean, it's basically a pyramid that has a very large base of young people. And those people, you know, you have 60,000 Saudis being educated abroad. A good percentage of them are here in the United States. When they go back and meet with their colleagues who have been educated in Saudi Arabia, they're going to demand a lot of things. They could be an agent of success if they are used properly and allowed to manifest themselves, to demonstrate themselves. So in terms of Saudi Arabia, I see it moving in the right direction. It's got a good chance of success. Kuwait, it's a different story. In terms of reforms, yes, we need to reform, more or less like Emirates, like Oman, like everything. But in Kuwait, let's remember that Kuwait political situation is dramatically different than Saudi Arabia. Kuwait, before oil, elected its first parliament in 1936. Not many of you know that. And it was a challenge to the government that forced an election in 1936, what's called the first constitutional assembly. So, however, what's common between Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the countries, which is going to be detrimental to the reform, is that how the social contract between the people and the rulers have materialized in terms of the generosity of sharing the wealth of oil with the public in a very inefficient way, whether it is through subsidies or employment in the public sector. So most of the people in the Gulf countries most of the young people look for employment in the public sector. Recently, there's been a survey I was looking at, 60 to 80%, depending on which country, of the young graduates are looking for employment in the public sector. It pays well, it's guaranteed, and you don't have to work hard at all. So that has to be changed. That mentality has to be changed, and that is going to be the challenge for the government. If there's going to be a weakness in all of these reforms, how do you make that change? You have the social contract that's based on dishing out those subsidies, these benefits, which really makes the people don't really want to work effectively. On the other hand, you really need to solve this problem because the oil revenues are gone. They're not going to pay for it. Maybe Kuwait, it will wait 2 or 3 decades. Saudi Arabia, you only have a window of opportunity of 1 or 2 decades at maximum.
And so I want to turn now to talk about Vision 2030 and what's happening in the kingdom. But just quickly before I do, just a follow up. So you talked about reasons why people may be optimistic that there is a shift in policy, the concerns they had about the last administration, and sort of glossed over what we've seen, I think, in the last week. And I was just wondering if you could offer your own reactions to the announcements about immigration targeted at 7 predominantly Muslim countries, and it's had ripple effects elsewhere, including some of the people who are going to join us who are concerned about the uncertainty with regard to U.S. visa policy now. So just how did you react to that, and what do you think it might mean for the U.S. relationship and the perception of the U.S. in the region right now?
But again, I think there's two line of thoughts there. The majority of the people don't look at it in any way as being good. They look at it as being a bad policy, discriminatory, confirming the anti-Muslim, the anti-Arab sentiments that has been very visible of late in the United States after 9/11. And so from that point of view, if you take a survey among the public, you will find most of the people in Kuwait and the Gulf countries and the Arab world really feel very threatened and they feel insecure. On the other hand, if you talk to officials, again, I reiterate what I said, officials don't see it necessarily as being that bad. They think this is bad only on the surface. This is just a rhetoric that President Trump has to do, and actually it doesn't even touch the Gulf countries. None of the Gulf countries is touched by it, and so, okay, and it's going to go away, it's going to be diluted and what have you. So that's, I think if you ask me personally what I think about what's happening in the United States under the Trump administration, I was telling my colleagues earlier, is that I see it as a manifestation of a phase change that has been brewing in the United States and nobody noticed it. It's just like, when you heat up water in a kettle and it warms up and warms up, and if you don't know about the phenomena of boiling, you don't really realize what's going to happen, and suddenly it boils and you say, what's happening? Water has changed into another phase, which is vapor. The same thing, I think, is happening in the United States. People did not recognize what is brewing underneath, and now we have this new change in the United States. Is that bad? I think my own view is that a lot of it could be challenging, not only to the United States, but to the world at large, and we better be prepared for it.
Bernie, let me turn to you to talk a little bit about the situation in the kingdom now, and the Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Plan launched with a lot of fanfare. The Deputy Crown Prince on the cover of lots of business magazines, Western magazines, and an incredibly ambitious and rapid agenda, and a very difficult set of reforms. I mean, first of all, there's hundreds of them, so it's hard to know even what we're talking about and how to prioritize them. A lot going on kind of all at the same time, the Aramco IPO being one of the most notable efforts, and very complex, and raises questions about the social contract within the kingdom, about the relationship between the royal family and the clerical leadership. Give us your sense about where the reform implementation stands and where it's headed.
If you've met the Deputy Crown Prince, you'll notice, and I'm sure the ambassador has, you'll notice that he's a very young and dynamic individual, quite charismatic. He has a quality that I've only seen in people like Bill Clinton, where if he's with you, you feel like you're the most important person in the room. So he has that politician's touch, and it's quite compelling for many visitors, which is why I think a lot of the coverage from the newspapers, and whether it's Bloomberg or The Economist, has been very complimentary. Now, he realizes that change is inevitable, that the dependency of the kingdom on oil is unsustainable, and that change has to happen. And he's pushed this vision, which involves, among other things, gradual removal of subsidies on electricity, water, and gasoline on fuel, a VAT tax, which was just, in fact, approved today by the Council of Ministers, and a number of other reduction in government salaries, and a number of other measures, which have been necessary for a very long time, and actually should have happened in the good days when Saudi Arabia was experiencing a period of overabundance of wealth between 2004 and 2014, and that didn't happen. So he's pushing through. Now, if you talk to people on the street and amongst in the business community, as well as young people, I think a lot of people are skeptical about the possibility of actually fulfilling the entire program. But many will tell you, look, if we can only get 20 or 30% done, that would be already a great thing for the country. So there is certainly skepticism, but there's also hope, especially amongst the young folk who seem to identify with him. Then the short-term effects of this transformation are have hit the economy in a hard way. And you feel that there's a decline in consumption, that the private sector is quite worried about certainly some of the labor changes in the labor law, and Stffen has actually written very, very well and eloquently on all of this. So there is a lot of fear, but there's also, I think, some hope, and certainly there are people who are optimistic that even if he gets as I said, 30% of it done, that would be a good thing. In any case, I think there is a general feeling that this has to happen, and it should have happened earlier, but it has to happen. And the question is how and how quickly, and what the consequences politically are going to be. Now, while all of this is happening domestically, which is all aimed at diversifying the economy and creating jobs for the young Saudis with this demographic bubble that Adnan was talking about, you have an extremely turbulent and hostile regional environment with a war in Yemen and a collapsing state in Syria, in Iraq, problems there, Egypt, and so on. So I think there's a sense also amongst the Saudi people that even though things are going to get difficult and are already beginning to feel difficult domestically, we still have it good compared to the other people in the region, right? So my sense is that the government can actually even push harder on these reforms because the population really has no alternative.
Because you're saying as much as people may not like to see salary and benefits cut and higher fuel prices, they think they have it better than Iraq. They don't want, or
yeah, there's no question that they have it better than Iraq, and or so, Syria, or Egypt, or Yemen, and so on.
I want to ask you a follow-up, but first, Ambassador, I know you have spent time with the Deputy Crown Prince. He's someone that has raised a lot of interest in understanding. Can you just offer your reflections and your impressions of him?
Well, I would agree with you. He's quite an interesting person. He was educated in Saudi Arabia, not in Europe or the United States like a lot of other Saudis. He's very well read. I think he's very focused and drives his people, his team, and his staff harder than I've ever seen anybody drive anybody. I used to go to meet with him sometimes as late as 10 o'clock at night, and I would run into ministers sitting there on a waiting room, sleeping, knowing they were going to spend the whole night and then be up early again the next day to continue working. So he's driving hard. Saudi culture and society sometimes make it difficult for this to be a consistent process. By that, I'll tell you a little. I was giving a speech one morning, a breakfast speech, and a very prominent member of the government said to me, "Well, Ambassador, I think this was around the time frame of it was August, maybe early September, August, I think. We haven't heard much from the United States, from your government, on our transformation plan in the last few weeks. We've been waiting to hear more from you. I said, we have been working on this harder than you have been working on it, because school vacations took all of you out of town. Began with Ramadan and then went into the summer holiday period and government closing and this and that, and the end result was that we were working on your transformation much harder than you were working on it. Now, when you get back to work, we'll be glad to collaborate with you. So despite these sort of sometimes impediments, they are working very hard on it. I think it's a godsend. I mean, I think that the low oil prices are a godsend to Saudi Arabia. I don't think they can afford to have continued with high oil prices under the scenarios that they were living under. I don't think their future generations will find that acceptable. I don't think the benefits would trickle down. The amount of corruption was significant in the past. I think the Deputy Crown Prince is acting, in fact, a lot on his father's determination. Many people think, oh, he's elderly. Some people think he's on throes of Alzheimer's and all of this. This is not the case. I've met with him numerous times, one-on-one. He's quite there, and he's quite adamant about some of these changes needing to take place. And sometimes he'll put restrictions on his son. For example, if there are certain steps taken, and including the Crown Prince will do the same thing, on some, what you mentioned, for example, the reductions in salaries and some of the benefit reductions that were made, some of them were done to the military and were abruptly announced, and they were immediately stopped, because here's a country fighting a war in Yemen, here's a country fighting terrorism inside its own borders, so the Ministry of Interior and its forces, it wouldn't be really good morale booster to cut their pay and reduce their benefits. So they're learning. The other thing I would say is that, Adnan mentioned this, I think they have been for a long time, 75% of working Saudis work for the government. And that's not sustainable in any society. And so this downturn in the economy has forced a real hard look at how do we become a 21st century economy here? How do we create bring in more foreign investment, create more jobs, diversify our economy in a country that traditionally has produced almost nothing, grows almost nothing, and exports, 75% of its exports are oil. So how sustainable is that into the global economy that we're all living in is I think, and I'm getting away from your question about Deputy Crown Prince. He is dynamic, and I think he's pushing hard. He's learning, and he's working with a bureaucracy, a government that has very talented people, very talented people, well educated, highly versatile at the top, but not much of a bench below. When you look at our government here in the United States, when we've shut the government down in the past, we shut the government back in the Clinton administration for, about a month? Nobody felt it. Because our machinery of government is pretty deep. And even when we're functioning during transition periods, we've got a lot of talented people working at every level, and we delegate authority down. That's not the case in the Saudi government. So what he's been able to do is start building that bench. And you see it, for example, the new Minister of Finance, really dynamic, really important. Look at their budget document that they put out, the first budget document they put out this year. It's first of all, it's transparent. For the first time, they're actually putting real numbers on reports, and I think you can see the direction they're going in, and it is going to be very difficult and time sensitive.
Stffen, you wrote a great book, Oil and the State in Saudi Arabia. Do you agree that the oil price collapse has been a godsend to the kingdom?
Well, I'm always the Saudi bear on any panel. So before I kind of spell that out, I think a fundamental prefatory remark is useful to put everything that's been happening in perspective, no matter what our prediction is of what's going on in Saudi. I think what's definitely the case for all of us is that our prediction error has gone up dramatically because the place has become a lot less predictable and a lot less certain. It used to, in 2003 or in 2002 when King Abdullah was alive, you could make almost a point prediction of where policy would be a year or two later, and that's absolutely not the case anymore. So both very good and very bad things can happen much, much more rapidly and much, much more unpredictably. That was the case pretty much since from 1962 until 2000, January 2015. And in many ways, an old era of the Saudi state is over. The elite has been fundamentally reconfigured. The royal family, at least for the time being, functions fundamentally differently. Power has been very heavily centralized, whereas you used to have a system of stasis, of fiefdoms that checked each other, of excessive checks and balances within the state apparatus between the different princes. Now you have one player, Mohammed bin Salman, who's been empowered by his father to run all major policy areas, apart from internal security, pretty much single-handedly. He does that because his father has enabled him, so it's still, on behalf of the king, but no one has had that degree of power over the state apparatus and over policy since King Abdulaziz, who created the state. Even King Faisal was very powerful, was constrained through a coalition with half-brothers that had helped to bring him to power in 1962 and 1964. So that's a fundamental change. And I think that has brought about some very positive and very unexpected reforms. Some fiscal reforms that really stand in stark contrast to the 15, almost 20 years of denial that Saudi Arabia went through in the 1980s and up to 2000, when the oil price had gone down and really everything froze and nothing happened. So the energy price reforms, the cuts to the salaries, most recently the fiscal balance program that maps out non-oil revenue measures and spending scenarios until 2020, which is unprecedented. You never had fiscal planning that went beyond just 1 year. And these things, I think, in principle are positive, but there's also potentially a lack of counterweights and accountability on the top levels. So I think with the Deputy Crown Prince, you also have someone who can run with an idea, and people are not going to stop him. There's really no one who's going to stop him, apart from his father, who won't necessarily have like a deep technocratic opinion on things like whether to privatize Aramco or whether to put $45 billion into illiquid assets with SoftBank that will potentially be locked up for 12 years at a time when reserves are rapidly declining and they might be needed to defend the peg of the Saudi riyal. So I think we've seen a lot of encouraging things, but also a lot of things that could potentially go wrong. And that's fundamentally driven by the reconfiguration of power at the top. So the old Saudi state of collective princely rule is dead, and we're in a new era, and I think the senior players themselves are feeling their way into it. I think even Mohammed bin Salman, the king himself, Mohammed bin Naif, the crown prince, who's technically senior to Mohammed bin Salman, they're still feeling their way into what their authority is, what they can get away with, and what they can't. As regards the National Transformation Plan until 2020 and the Vision 2030, those are largely aspirational documents. So there isn't, for the time being, that much of an implementation machinery behind them. And some of the targets in, say, the Vision are at least quantitatively unreachable. The ambition to become one of the 15 largest economies in the world by 2030, that would require a GDP growth rate that no mid to high income country has ever achieved in human history. So it's an aspirational document, and the question is what the percentages that will be achieved. And there's of course a bit of a political risk in setting these very high targets and at the same time hitting the private sector and the population in the short run with unexpected overnight austerity measures. I think they've learned some of the lessons, and now the austerity is much more planned, gradual. There's this schedule, the advance warning through the fiscal balance program. But I think the structural fact remains that for the time being, there will have to be some form of austerity, and it will be contractionary. Even if there is diversification in the long run, in the short run, this is not going to offset, the cuts and the revenue measures that will eat into domestic consumption. So, especially in the fiscal balance program, a lot of the levers that they're pulling are the right ones. But even if you were the best technocrat in the world, I think the structural constraints in the short to medium run through the fiscal situation are pretty tough and will put the private sector and households in a pretty tight spot for the foreseeable future.
And we are an energy center, so I want to bring things back to energy. So how much of that is driven by the oil market situation? And if prices were to recover more sharply than expected, do things go back to complacency?
Well, they'd have to recover very substantially, I think. They'd have to go above 80, I think, to give them some sense of ease. And, I'm not primarily an oil forecaster, but it doesn't seem like the most...
We're going to come to Ed
It
for
doesn't,
that
it doesn't
in a
seem
minute.
like the most there might be a temporary spike, but I don't see prices, being at or above that level for an extended period. If that should be the case, yes, I think austerity would partially be postponed. It would certainly be slowed down. It might already now be slowed down because the contractionary effect is probably larger than the government expects. There's also an ambition to diversify the economy through investing in certain strategic assets, and that also requires quite a bit of money, at least the way that it has been envisaged through the vision and what the Public Investment Fund is supposed to do.
Do you agree with that, Bernie? That, is it sort of, there've been, we could have a stack of Vision 2020s and Vision 2030s, and there's been efforts before, not only in Saudi, in other countries too. And at some point, the fiscal pressures ease and the ambition eases along with it. Would we expect that, or is this time different?
I mean, look, if oil were to rebound, the temptation to kick the can down the road will be there. And I think it's hard to know, why some, the leadership would want to do this. Now, one reason for doing this could be political. I mean, it's not about economics; it's purely about the politics, of within the royal family that could lead to that. But my feeling from having met the top leadership and a lot of the technocrats is that they really know that the situation of relying on oil revenues is unsustainable, and that they're going to hit a wall, and they're trying to avoid that from happening.
And this idea that, the oil is only useful for a while, and we could really see long-term decline in oil demand and the pressures of climate change. How seriously is that? Do you think that's taken?
I think the Aramco IPO is partly driven by this idea that, oil may not be important in 20 or 30 years, and so why not, in a way, try to get as much money, right now by in essence, creating a concession where, and the exact framework of that concession, I mean, legal and financial, has yet to be, fully defined and elaborated. But essentially, I think the Deputy Crown Prince wants to generate as much revenue up front now from the oil that's in the ground, and in order to invest that money in a sovereign wealth fund, and with the hope that the sovereign wealth fund will generate revenue that will then, offset whatever happens to the oil market and the decline in its importance going forward.
You were nodding. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. At least in the context of Saudi Arabia, that's quite correct. I think if prices, for any reason, went to, let's say, 70 to 80, you will see some slowdown in the reforms in Saudi Arabia, but it will continue. But I think, as I said earlier, we are already in Kuwait resisting the reforms. And there is a reason for that probably cuts across all of the region. And this dichotomy between the people feel that they have a stake, they have a share, and that share has been given to them in one way, and it's very difficult to take it from them. It's extremely difficult to take it from them. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, I think it is not that strong down at the young people, but in a small country like Kuwait or the Emirate, it is very, very strong. And therefore, I would say that if prices go to 70, which I don't think they will do, and I don't advise the policymaker who are in charge of OPEC or oil to allow that to happen, because I think that would be detrimental. I think you will see some countries almost give up reforms, and first and foremost would be a country like Kuwait.
Well, fortunately, we have someone who knows what's going to happen to the oil price. Ed, can you talk about what's happening in the market, how the reforms in the region are affecting and being affected by global markets? And then a big question about the oil price is obviously what's going to happen with U.S. shale, among other factors. So a little bit of your thoughts on where that's headed.
Yeah, well, I don't think I have any special word that gives me a divine view on the market. I think we just all work with probabilities, and I think there is likely to be disappointment within the kingdom and in other countries, in that I think they still radically underestimate the resiliency of not just shale, but it's all of the unconventional resources that, as Adnan and we were discussing earlier, demand was dramatically impacted by higher prices, and supply was dramatically impacted by higher prices. So we had a significant record amount of capital spent in three general areas of what we call unconventional resources. Unconventional because they were not within a really financial reach at a lower price, and then suddenly at a higher sustained price. We had three resources that were exploited, shale being one of them and the most robust of them, but the other two were deep water and oil sands in Canada. And you could measure the trigger point for all of these at the end of the last decade, when we had oil prices going up and these resources started to be exploited. In 2009, the annual growth from these three resources was a little over 300,000 barrels a day. In 2014, the annualized result of these three resources was 2,200,000 barrels a day year on year. And over the period during which we had significant disruptions to supply, whether at the beginning from Libya or later from Yemen or Sudan or later from sanctions being imposed on Iran, 7.1 million barrels a day of new supply coming into the market between 2009 and the end of 2014. And prices came down. There was a judgment made, and you could see it in official Saudi statements made both at the beginning and the end of September 2014 through the OPEC meeting that didn't take place, but the public statements were very optimistic that U.S. shale was going to basically collapse within a half a year. Companies that should never have been brought into the existence would go bankrupt, and we'd be back in a more normalized world. And yes, it is true that shale decline rates are high, and they still sometimes very senior people think about shale having a 70% decline rate, but they forget about a base. So yes, U.S. production has gone down from 2014 until it stabilized last fall, but we only lost 20% of U.S. production over a 2-year period of time. This is not a 70% overall declining resource base. So I think there's still a bit of too much optimism in the market in terms of how much this resource base will struggle to get to a point where it won't overwhelm the market. We actually published this morning a 5-year outlook. I think it's the most thorough 5-year outlook from a demand and supply perspective that I know of. Certainly better than what the IEA did, better than what the OPEC Secretariat did, and I think in many ways better than what the EIA has done. And as we look at the unconventional resources, it's not just shale. And indeed, if you look at oil sands, projects were postponed or canceled. But oil sands in Canada, the production is going to grow by 500,000 barrels a day, at least, because that's sanctioned kind of mechanical, industrial kinds of projects between now and 2022. And already we're seeing projects being sanctioned again. In October, after a 2-year lull on oil sands projects being sanctioned, we had a project sanctioned. And if you talk to the Canadian companies and you look at what happens with Keystone XL or what happens with the new expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, they're making projections for themselves that would double that production growth between now and 2022. Or if you turn to deep water, which are the longest lead time of all projects, and as Adrian has written, deep water in Mexico is a mid-next decade phenomenon, not much that could happen before that. On the other hand, there are deep water projects in existence. There's a fundamental change in the administration of deep water in Brazil, and here another unconventional area where there's a projected, again, 400,000 barrel a day growth over the next 4 years in Brazil, and it looks as though that could double too, just on the basis of changes within Brazil and the governance of the oil sector at a higher price. So
does this all mean that OPEC's recent action to try to cut production is just a fool's errand, and they're giving up, letting everyone else come back and grow? And
I think there were good reasons to try to accelerate the rebalancing of the market, but as we look at that, the call on U.S. crude starting in 2018, if we look at that as rather than a call on OPEC, a call on U.S. crude to balance the market, we have post-2018 U.S. crude growing at a faster rate than the call on U.S. crude. So yeah, I think we get to maybe the mid-$60 range on an optimistic basis by the end of 2017, but the three countries I mentioned, the three sources of unconventional oil, are not alone. Russian production has continued to grow. Again, another Saudi mistake where they thought not only would U.S. production collapse, but that Russian production would decline by 500,000 barrels a day. And the reverse has happened. It's also grown. So we think that already sanctioned projects and a view on the demand side that I'll speak to for about 2 seconds will not be enough to really balance the market. And you've got OPEC countries that are going to be growing, including the UAE, potentially Kuwait. Certainly there's potential growth in Iran and Iraq. So it's going to be an oversupplied market. And on the demand side, the higher prices have led to two things. One, it's accelerated the decline in the elasticity of oil product demand versus GDP growth. And GDP in the world is not growing the way it had been. We're not in a last decade 4.5% per annum GDP growth environment. We're in a 3%, and maybe it'll get to 3.5% GDP growth environment. And the elasticity has gone down, and the dramatic substitution effect, where we have natural gas to a bit and electricity for sure, that are being more competitive with oil, and oil's monopoly in the transport fuel sector. So demand is unlikely at even a low price to be able to generate the kind of level that would balance the market. So I think the oil market is going to be problematic in short.
So there's a lot we haven't gotten to, but we have so much expertise in this room. I want to make sure we have time for questions from everyone. And so we have a microphone over there. And so I'd ask people with questions to please, if you could, sorry for the inconvenience, come and stand at the microphone. And while people are doing that, I'll just ask one final question while people are getting up to move over there. Because what I've heard is sort of whoever wants to take this, or I'll call on someone. But my takeaway from what I've heard is seriousness about an economic reform agenda to diversify Gulf economies away from dependence on oil. It's very difficult. It's going to take time. These are not reforms that one implements overnight. So even if you execute perfectly, which is hard to do, it's going to take many years before you can build a robust non-oil private sector in the kingdom or elsewhere, build up services sector, education system, everything you need around it, attract foreign investment, open up your society to foreign investment, the implications that has for the social contract, for clerical leadership in the kingdom. But as Ed said, this fiscal pressure and the amount of austerity that's going to be demanded of people in the meantime might be really acute. And so there seems to be a disconnect between the time in which it takes to pull this off and the amount of pressure that people are feeling in the nearer term. And I'm just wondering if people could talk about how that plays out and whether that's sustainable. I can call on someone, but I mean, Bernie or Stffen may have thoughts, the ambassador may have thoughts.
Just to add this, I mean, I think that you know, to achieve some of these goals, particularly in terms of jobs for Saudis, 60% being under the age of 30, the requirements of education and training are important, and they realize that the education system that they have in place in Saudi Arabia, and even the one that they're using in Europe and the United States, is not adequate to educate that population to the job market and the job market growth they want to see. So they realize that, they're working that, they're making changes in the scholarship program, they're making changes to teacher development and teacher training and curriculum in the primary, secondary education. It's hard, they're being fought and pushed back by the religious and more conservative community, but it is one of those imperatives that the leadership realizes it has to tend to. And in the banking area, that's the other area I would mention, they've made quite good decisions about banking, about moving money to private banks, about bond issues that have been fairly successful. So I think they are moving, as Stffen mentioned, it's very difficult, and there are going to be operational problems with some of this, but I'm more optimistic about the efforts that are being made and about the direction in which it's going than I would be if oil prices somehow jumped or an IPO gave Saudi Arabia several $billions and somebody would say, well, let's just drop all of this, we're okay now. That's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen.
Any other comment on that?
Yeah, just second what the ambassador said about jobs, that this is what the political economy of the whole system boils down to. And it will be very difficult to create more Saudi employment in the private sector at a time when practically the only source of demand in the economy, which is government spending, directly or indirectly, is going to shrink in net terms, either because total spending is going down or because there will be an increasing tax take, taking back some of the money that goes into the economy. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that challenge, the current share of government wages in GDP is around about 15%. The share of wages paid to Saudis in the private sectors is about 4%. The share of wages paid to expatriates in the private sector is also about 4%, and almost all of this is remitted abroad. And there are millions of expatriates, but they are at such low wages that if you Saudiize these jobs, either you create a huge cost problem because the wages have to go up, or you drastically shrink the employment that you can provide.
All right, so let's go to questions. And also, if we had a bigger table, we would have added more panelists, including Greg Gause, who I see over there, who knows as much as anyone up here about these topics. And maybe we can encourage him to come to the microphone and make a comment or reflection on some of what he's heard up here as a panelist in absentia. But please ask, if you could briefly identify yourself and ask a question.
Khalid Al-Mari, Yemeni American. After the Arab Spring, Yemen was on the verge of financial meltdown, especially with low oil prices. Now that the civil war in its second year, the country is experiencing famine, you could say a complete meltdown. Knowing what you know today, what adjustment do you recommend to the Trump administration? Also, why isn't the Allies forces headed by Saudi Arabia targeting militia leaders and go after the former dictator? Thank you.
I think what I might do is take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then let people respond to those. So if you could just keep track of those. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Joanne Dixon. I work in power sector restructuring, specifically in Saudi Arabia for the last 5 years. And looking at the Vision 2030 plan, I don't see specifically the power sector transformation listed as one of the objectives, which is something that it's been ongoing for a number of years to go from a vertically integrated sector to a market-oriented, transparent sector that there already is an international investment, but to have it on a wider scale. So I just wanted to know if that's actually part of the 2030 plan that I haven't seen or is contemplated. Thank you.
I think it is, so, but we'll come to that. And there was one other question. Was that?
My name is Ahmed. My question is twofold. One is energy, one's more geopolitics related. I tried to write it down because I'll have to think about it otherwise, which will be longer. I know we don't have time. But from an energy perspective, with the Trump administration, one thing that concerns me is renewables in particular, and I'm curious about the interplay with the rest of the world because China, which Trump has said many times he believes concocted climate change as a hoax, has been investing $300 billion in the next 3 years, creating 13,000 jobs. We see these kind of initiatives in the GCC in the Middle East. Is there a fear that America might fall behind? We've reached grid parity. We're obviously transitioning to clean coal based on your comments. How alarming is it and concerning is it that Trump, and not only his own views, but his cabinet, reflect this very dismissive attitude towards renewables? He in fact thinks that the reason wind farms are bad is because they kill birds. But more skyscrapers kill birds every year by far. It's in fact 1 billion, but that's a side note. The other one is just from a geopolitical perspective. We've been talking about the Emirates. The Emirates' top diplomat came out this week, I think maybe even just yesterday or today, and he validated Trump's ban and in fact defended it. It was a break with some of what we've heard from the panelists, and in general, I think a lot of the concern about the policies that Trump has in the Middle East tend to focus on the ban, but there's also Steve Bannon and many other people who Trump has put in a very high position of power who pose a much bigger threat potentially to citizens from the UAE. So I'm not talking about economics, but students here, and even just some of the things you touched on with regards to perceptions of Muslims. So just those two questions about Trump and the administration's effects on the Middle East.
Great, thank you. All right, let's see, take those. Who wants to talk about Vision 2030 in the power sector? I think it is part of it. I think they're planning to privatize utilities, and you want to say a word about it?
Yeah. There's not much in the vision. I think the really relevant document is the fiscal balance program, where they say that they want to liberalize energy prices by 2020, or at least index them to some international benchmark that they haven't defined yet, but which I don't think is terribly difficult to define. They've done something similar in Qatar, in Oman, and in the UAE already for transport fuels. It'll be a bit trickier for gas, but they'll find a mechanism there. And of course, when that happens, that will potentially make the entrance to the energy production distribution sector more attractive for private investors. But they already have a quite successful model of public-private partnerships in power generation, and they just have to separate the off-take prices from the retail prices. So I think this is one of the areas in which there will be reform, because the formula, the regulatory framework that's needed is relatively clear, and also the jurisdictions that previously were fragmented have been consolidated in the new Ministry of Energy, which is responsible both for domestic energy production, electricity, gas, and the upstream sector. And that was previously a big issue because there were very different interests on the part of Aramco and the Ministry of Petroleum on the one hand, and Saudi Electric Company and the Ministry of Electricity on the other. And Khalid Al-Falih is a quite competent technocrat, as was said. So I think this is one of the areas in which there is going to be movement, and where there is already a model for cooperation established, and where there's also going to be probably a regulatory framework for renewables and feed-in tariffs. And I think there will be also quite a bit of development in the solar area.
And so, Ahmed, your question was about, well, there were two, but the second about whether there should be more concern about the human impacts of some of the policies that we've seen with the immigration.
Yeah, I didn't want to bring up conflicts of interest, but it's obviously known to many people in this room that President Trump has a lot of business interests, the golf club in the Emirates, and I just wonder, political posturing aside, You know, I just came back from Quebec just yesterday where 6 Muslims were killed, and a lot of people in the streets told me that the concerns that they feel are about how it affects their communities and people's perceptions of their neighbors. Beyond, like, how concerned do you think, in the energy context from these GCC countries, are they about Trump's ban in terms of how it affects the bottom line and their industries, or versus just their citizenship and, you know, their citizens?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. The bottom line, I think, will be affected by something like this. No question about it, for us and for those countries. But I think, you know, the decisions that are being made are being made by executive order. I actually think Trump is actually brilliant in this arena. How many executive orders has he issued so far in a week and a half?
A lot.
A lot. Well, you know, President Obama issued a lot of executive orders. I was against executive orders. I even talked to him about it one time. I don't think that that's the way our government should be run. We're not a presidential system. We're a representative democracy. So presidents issuing executive orders can do it and get away with some type of implementation of that if Congress doesn't resist or doesn't react or doesn't act on it. But at the end of the day, all of these executive orders that he has issued and will issue in the future will require Congress to agree, will require Congress to fund, will require the executive branches to operationalize. In the case of the ban for these countries, it is intended to allow the various agencies of our government, like the DHS and the FBI and the State Department and others, to assess what due diligence they need to do to ensure that as you allow people to immigrate into the United States or to visit the United States, whatever the reason for coming in, that there's enough due diligence to make sure that we are at least keeping terrorists out of the country. As hard as that may be, I think that they haven't really explained clearly that this is, remember he said it was a 90-day ban, not a forever ban. So that 90 days is intended to do that. I think they should have come up with a much more aggressive explanation of what they intend to do in these 90 days to come up with a solution that is amenable to us as a people and to those countries that are affected or potentially affected. And as you said, even people who are not in one of those countries are now thinking twice about whether they want to travel and arrive here and be turned back for whatever reason. So I think it has a pretty bad cumulative effect. But again, I think that a lot of it, I mean, I have a lot of faith in our country. If you look at our history, we have been through huge periods of turmoil in our history, throughout our history. And it's like a pendulum. We always seem to bounce back from those periods of turmoil, whether it's a civil war, whether it's slavery, whether it's McCarthy era, Vietnam, you name it. We come back. I think, we're going through a difficult period, but we will restore.
Yeah.
A lot of it is going to be up to Congress to review this, and I think the Republican majorities in both houses are probably quite concerned about how they're going to address all of these issues and these executive orders as they move down the road.
Yeah, of course, we see every day reports about how it's affected people and families, and some of those I see by following you on Twitter. So you've illustrated some of those too. I'll just say a word, unless anyone else wants to take it, maybe Ed, but we hosted several people last week who either advised Trump or had worked in the previous Republican administration about where energy policy was headed. You asked about renewables. I think it's clear there will be increased focus on hydrocarbons versus renewables, an effort to dramatically increase hydrocarbon production by opening new areas to drilling, reducing regulations, approving new pipelines. I think it's unclear how much impact that actually has on production, because even people in industry will often acknowledge that those regulations haven't been the primary thing withholding production. It's been market forces and other things. It's not clear that there's ideological opposition to renewables. I think there'll be less inclination to support, subsidize, mandate, but there is some bipartisan support, certainly, for renewable energy. There's a lot of wind power and employment created by wind in the Midwest. Senators who continue to support the ITC and PTC, the tax credits for solar and wind. So I don't know if they take a dramatic step backwards, but there'll be less focus on advancing it. Anything you want to add to that?
No, yeah, I would like to add that market forces are kind of working in the same direction that subsidies were working over the last few years. It's unlikely that a utility that is considering building a new thermal power plant based on coal with a 50-year life expectancy with uncertain future regulatory issues, it's really unlikely that we're going to see many, if any, new thermal power plants based on coal built in the country. We'll still see plants retiring because they are 40 or 50 years old, and the cost of the investment is just not worth it. And meanwhile, our power demand has stagnated, just as power demand in other advanced economies has stagnated, and virtually all the incremental demand after the big spike in natural gas demand for power gen in the U.S. and in Europe has really been taken up by renewables. And now renewables can compete to a significant degree against alternative sources of supply. So I suspect the growth of renewables is going to continue, maybe even at the same pace that it has grown to date.
So I want to get in the final three questions, give people a chance to respond before we wrap up. So,
Well, we never answered the Yemen question.
oh, sorry, you're right. You want to? Are you volunteering?
I really don't want to answer it, but I'll start. I can't think of a more complicated situation that we've faced in the last several years than the Yemen situation. It's so complex, given the nature of the country, the fact that you have Ali Abdullah Saleh still operating pretty aggressively, the fact that you've got Iran engaged pretty aggressively, you've got a coalition that sees that threat led by Saudi Arabia. For us, it was a real conundrum as to how to support that, how to support Saudi Arabia, but at the same time restrain it. It's going to be a major issue for this administration as it was for the Obama administration. And the Obama administration, to think that any administration speaks only with one voice is a mistake. I mean, there were a lot of different voices within the administration as to how to deal with Yemen, as there were about how to deal with Syria and even Iraq. The president's major commitment was that he did not want to resolve all issues using military solutions. He was attempting to, diminish the air campaign in Yemen in order to establish some kind of a dialogue for peace. That was the effort onto the very last day of the administration. It didn't materialize. It didn't work. So it's a complicated problem, and the people of Yemen continue to suffer in very, very terrible situations. And I cannot tell you that I know how that's going to ever get resolved.
All right, so we only have a few minutes left, but people have been waiting patiently. So if we could take the final questions and then do a round of answers, please.
My name is Yusuf Zakaria. I'm a social political researcher. My question is for both analysts on Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Do you think that what are the consequences of diversifying the economy, as the expert said? It's how Gulf states function and the social contract, how the social contract there functions, and how people perceive state and state perceive their people out of generosity, quote unquote, which to be true to a great extent is true, but that being said, how will that function within the given 20, 30 years when they have to expect that the government will not directly be, quote unquote, the hand that feeds them.
Yeah, so a question about the social
The
contract.
social contract and the effects of that on both Saudi and Kuwaiti social
Great.
life. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
How's it going? My name is Hudson Curis. I'm a senior in the college, and multiple panelists mentioned the Aramco IPO, and so I had two questions about that. The first question is, how will this 15% or this partial ownership by the public affect the management of a formerly national or state oil company? And then the second question is, it seems like it's no secret that a lot of the capital raised in this IPO will be reinvested elsewhere and not back into Aramco itself. So what makes that still an attractive investment for investors and people who want to make a return on that capital?
Last question, and then we'll do a round of answers.
Hi, my name is Raul Samant. I'm with Ernst & Young. I have a really specific question. I hope somebody has an opinion or a comment. What is your sort of assessment of the country Oman? It's politically relatively stable, but no clear political successor. Doesn't have any natural resources left, pretty much. What do you guys think about the future of opportunities in the Sultanate of Oman? Thank you.
Thanks. All of you have looked carefully at the social contract in Saudi and Kuwait. Do you want to say a word about Saudi, and maybe Adnan about Kuwait?
Yeah, I think that it would depend on the question of taxation. So it's one thing to remove subsidies on energy. It's quite another to start taxing your population. And if, America is anything to go by, the issue of representation becomes important. So how the question of representation is handled is a complicated one. And I think that when Saudis think about parliaments and representation, they actually look at Kuwait. And they don't see a model that is terribly appealing. They think of it as extremely messy and complicated. So that's something that I think they haven't thought through, and they're going to defer that until such time as you end up getting people asking for a greater say in how they're ruled, which I think is inevitable once the issue of taxation comes into play. But at the moment, if you look at all of their plans, fiscal plans, there is no income tax that's being discussed. We're talking about VAT taxes on what they call white lands. These are lands that haven't been developed, undeveloped lands, many of which are owned by princes. So, there will be, and wealthy individuals, because they're only taxed above, I think, 10,000 square meters. And so, these are large, rich people own these properties. So, I think once we get into income tax, which is not being discussed, then the issues that you raise will become urgent.
Do you want to add anything?
When you talk to middle class Saudis that are now getting a $500 a month equivalent bill for sewage, for electricity, for water that they never got before, it affects their bottom line. It affects, they are worried about it, and they weren't counting on it, and all of a sudden they have to pay this bill. Where they're willing to compromise and see, let's see what happens, is because they also see change in that social contract in terms of social and cultural aspects of society. They see more freedom, more openness, opportunities for women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the trade-off. If you can achieve some of that, then we're willing to make some sacrifices. If you shut the door off to that, then what are we really gaining from this?
Do you want to add anything, or should we take the other?
Just quickly, I think on the transformation of the social contract in the Gulf countries, the bottom line, I think people would have to feel that it is win-win for them. that the changes is for the better. And in the case of Kuwait, I think the people are not willing right now to accept subsidy removal or shutting the door for public employment, because they feel that they have a stake in the oil revenues and it has to be somehow filtered to them. Now, coming up with a better model than the way it is done, people will accept it. But you have to demonstrate and convince them that the alternative model is win-win for them. And I think unless that's happening, it's going to be very difficult. Stffen has done a lot of work on this in Kuwait and demonstrated that if you lump all of the benefits and subsidies that people get per capita, I think 6,000 KD or something you came up with, and he demonstrated if you pay everybody 3,000, the government will pocket 3,000 and people will support that.
Ed, can you say a quick word about the Aramco IPO? I mean, this is a company that not only produces oil, but manages many other aspects of the state, from healthcare to many other things. What does it mean to take part of that private?
Well, I don't know. I thought part of the question was how successful might the IPO be, and why is this a rational investment? Part of the answer to that, I think, is a twist on what Bernie had said earlier, and Joe, you may have as well, about whether part of the accelerated reforms were really based on the notion that if oil has a limited lifespan, better to produce now than to produce later, and from a net present value basis, that would provide more value. I think the flip side of it is that if you have the lowest cost oil production in the world and oil is becoming a stranded asset, better someone else's asset be stranded than your own. And that means that there is part of a vision that this is a company that is uniquely situated to gain both value on the value chain by becoming a globally integrated company, and it's going to gain in terms of long-term market share at a lower prevailing price. So I think it's rational from that perspective. From a buying perspective, yeah, there are certain things that have to be worked out, like who owns the reserves and how does that get evaluated. We know that there's been a couple of well-known firms that have done an assessment. That assessment looks as though it makes Saudi self-assessment conservative rather than overstated. And 5% of what might be a $2 trillion evaluation on a company is $100 billion that can be reinvested. And the reinvestment is really a diversification of the internal risk portfolio of the kingdom itself. So moving off of oil has a rational kind of complement to it on diversifying revenue base. And I suspect that the appetite for it would be great, that institutional investors would have a significant interest in it. Sovereign wealth funds would have a significant interest in it. It would be very upsetting to a market where, from an investor perspective, if you're a portfolio manager, you want to have a certain amount allocated to, the top companies in the world, and this is going to shove out somebody from someone's investment portfolio. But on the whole, I think it's more rational than not, both from a Saudi perspective and an investor perspective.
And that's a topic we'll dig more deeply into at our Global Energy Summit in April, when the CEO of Saudi Aramco joins us as a keynote speaker. Thoughts on Oman, just to close out quickly?
Yeah, one very brief point on the social contract, and that's perhaps a note of long-term optimism. I do think that people adjust. The Saudis are working in jobs nowadays that they didn't work in 20 or 30 years ago, just out of economic necessity. I don't think that's an easy adjustment. It's going to be wrenching, but it happens. If there's no public sector job, then people will be willing to do stuff that they weren't willing to do before. And that's, in terms of drivers, clerks, even women touting tickets for theme parks, which was recently started happening in Riyadh. Those things change. On Oman, I think the big question is whether it is going to be Bahrainized, in the sense that it might have to be bailed out by its neighbors and might lose a lot of its previously very high level of independence regarding regional diplomacy. Is this going to happen, or will the leadership take the risk of not asking for a bailout, but then be potentially heading for a full-blown socioeconomic crisis at a time when the leader is fairly old and frail? There's no clear succession scenario, and different from all the other Gulf countries, there's no powerful ruling family to hold the system stable when the leader fails. So it's a very unpredictable case.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you for joining us. There's so many things to talk about and so many questions and uncertainties given the new administration here and what's happening in the oil market, and that will make it all the more interesting when we bring this group and additional guests together next year to talk again about what's happening in the Gulf Arab states and what it means for energy, economy, and geopolitics. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists today.